So let's take a look at our discussion questions for this unit. There we go. So the first question, was the Maccabean rebellion a revolt or a civil war? And what were some of the Maccabees' political, cultural, religious missteps after their military success against the Syrian Greeks?
Well, you already answered that in a sense. I mean, obviously it was a revolt in some sense, but it was clearly a civil war as well between the more Hellenized Jews and non-Hellenized Jews. And then the Maccabees went ahead and did the various things that the Hellenized Jews had done and created all the same problems, declaring themselves kings and priests and so forth.
This is one of the risks of a pious rebellion. There's always somebody more pious. And
well, I think historically, not just here, but if you look at Ayatollahs or you look at whoever you want, it starts off with some guy who's the most pious, and then after that it kind of disintegrates reasonably quickly because people realize there's realistic things you have to do to rule, and it's great to be pious, but that doesn't always work out all that well.
Right.
I mean, and frankly, the question is just a matter of labels, and doesn't have to be a revolt or a civil war. The fact is, they were really oppressed by the Greeks, and so in that sense, it was a revolt. But the fact that so many of their fellow countrymen were collaborators, it was a civil war. So it was both.
Right. And according to the Book of Maccabees, it was an externally provoked thing, as well as an internally provoked. You had some parts that were the Jews assimilating on their own, and some was the decree of Antiochus saying now they're not allowed to do these things and forbidding certain things, and that's when it becomes a point of rebellion.
So what happened was that the Maccabees, their family was able to take over and succeed, and then they were primaried. That's an old story.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's the same thing with Saudi Arabia. The current House of Saud was one of the sort of sponsors of Wahhabism as this radical fundamentalist Islam, and then the Wahhabis have been taken over by the Bin Ladens, who then hate the Saudis, and you get hoisted on your own petard, so to speak. Okay, number 2, what is the historical story of Hanukkah?
Rabbi, I found one of the things most fascinating about this whole series so far is how there's more than one presentation of the history in all the things that you've been presenting, in different parts of the Bible. And the same thing happens here with the story of Hanukkah. I mean, it's sort of eye-opening to me that, the whole, and it was really obvious, that there was nothing talking about this miracle, and it was just the whole, festival of 8 days, which may have been similar to Sukkot. So I think the story ended up getting co-opted in some ways to make it sound more aggrandizing it more than it might have been in reality.
Do you know that the American Declaration of Independence was not signed on July 4th?
It was signed on my birthday, July 3rd.
Well, presumably there was someone who signed it on July 4th. It was done over a period of time as they brought it to different people.
Well, actually, in the original John Adams letter who wrote about it, he said it was July 3rd they would be celebrated. But
yeah. Well, and then, there's that famous painting of everybody there to sign it. And there's a great scene at the end of the John Adams miniseries. It was on HBO. I think it was on Netflix for a while, where he's shown this painting that's done in the 1820s. Just he's at the end of his life, and he says, "This is BS. This never happened like this. You never had everybody there at once, because this is a painting that depicts all the signers." And he said, "We were never all there at the same time."
Of course not. They were away for the 4th of July weekend.
Okay. All right. So the point is, you get the idea that, we create these stories that may not have a strong basis in reality, or they get reinterpreted over time as something different. So that this is just one more example. Absolutely. Okay, number 3, what were some of the Greek influences on Jewish life in this period? And how would you describe the synthesis of the two cultural traditions?
We definitely went over that with the gymnasiums, the theaters, the lack of circumcision, the different religious practices, the different eating practices, different
Language?
clothing.
Language, absolutely, too. Right.
I'd probably just call it Hellenistic Judaism.
Right, because it's, again, it's not just Hellenizing. They're not just becoming Greek. They're finding middle grounds or syntheses between their culture, their language, their traditions, and Greek culture and its influence. And everything, even the location of the marketplace, makes a big difference in terms of lifestyle. I mean, again, think about Jewish life before businessmen,
Was Hellenistic Judaism closer to conservative or reform?
Well, depends on where you were. My guess is Hellenistic in Judea was more conservative, and Hellenistic in Alexandria might have been more reform.
Do we have any evidence or any inputs about intermarriage? Were the Greek men marrying Jewish women and the women marrying men? Do we know anything about that?
See, the problem is intermarriage has sort of 2 levels to it. One is marrying someone from another background, and the other is marrying someone from another background and you can both maintain your separate identities. That's different. Okay. So there are plenty of examples of Jews, Judeans, Hebrews marrying other peoples all through this period and into the future, in the Middle Ages. Again, it's not an accident that the Jews in Yemen look different from the Jews in Poland, and it's not because of the air and the water. It's because they married local people. In fact, the genetics even suggest a lot of these far-flung Jewish communities were Jewish men who traveled and married local women, because the mitochondrial DNA, which you only get from the egg, from the woman, is similar to the surrounding populace. But that doesn't mean they could maintain their otherness while being married to a Jewish man. In fact, they were thought to be converted, or at least sort of adopted into Judean practice. So if there were Greek women or women of Greek background who Judeans married, they made them Jewish. They became part of Jewish religious practice. So it might have been, genetically intermarriage, but it wasn't the kind of cultural intermarriage that we're thinking of, where a Jew would marry a Greek and then they do, a Greek-Jewish winter festival or something. That's not what was happening back then.
So you're saying that when couples had different backgrounds, one would assimilate into the other for the sake of a homogeneous family.
And because it was just thought you couldn't be in 2 places. Now, I will say, if you were 2 polytheistic traditions, you might be able to make it work, right? Because you call this god Zeus and I call him Mazda, or I call him Baal, or I call him something. And then you've got a goddess of the hearth with different names. And so, you could agree to disagree. You say potato, I say potato. You say Ahura Mazda, I say Baal. You make it work. But when you have one that's a monotheistic tradition and one that's a polytheistic tradition, it's very hard to square that circle, because they're seen as being in fundamental conflict. And in a patriarchal era, generally women followed the men. Now, again, remember, this is the era where you've got 2 trends happening. You've got the Ezra the priest, pure seed, send away the foreign wives, no intermarriage message. And you've also got the book of Ruth, marry a Moabite, bring her into the people, become part of the family, become the ancestor of King David. That trend is there too. So you really have both ideological trends sort of battling for preeminence. Ultimately, the holy seed, no intermarriage trend will seem to win out. But even in rabbinic literature, a couple hundred years later, they're debating, what do we do with the children of non-Jewish women and Jewish men, which they wouldn't do if it never happened.
Right.
So they're debating a reality that's happening even through this period. So it's always happened. The question is whether you can find a space to be both in the household. That's a modern phenomenon, much more than in the ancient world. Okay. Next one. So how does the assigned reading from Philo demonstrate the combination of Jewish religious thought with Greek philosophy? That's if you decided to read that piece from the early chapters of Philo's work. It demonstrates this idea of Moses as the lawgiver. It tries to prove, by the way, that 6 is the most perfect number, because he has to explain, why does it say in the Torah God made the world in 6 days? Why 6? Why not 3? Why not 2? Why not 1 second? The answer Philo gives is that 6 is the most perfect number because it is both the sum and the product of its parts. 1 plus 2 plus 3 equals 6. 1 times 2 times 3 equals 6. It's the only number that that's true for. It's the perfect number. Are you convinced? This is the difference between logic and reason, okay? So he's using logic to make a point, but it's not reasonable that that makes more sense than any other arbitrary number of days in which to make the world. But he's, again, trying to prove that the statements contained in the Torah can be consistent with philosophy and reason and logic. That's why he makes Moses the lawgiver. Moses has the deepest insight into the natural world, and that's why he's able to create these timeless truths, and off you go.
Well, it's interesting that he picks up the term, 6 is a perfect number, because that is a concept that exists within mathematics. 6 is called a perfect number in mathematics. And I think it's because it's the sum of the product. I don't even remember the definition, but that's not totally drawn out of the air. That links to mathematical definitions.
Sure. And Philo might not have been the first person to be so excited about the number 6.
Susie, it's the sum and the product of prime numbers.
Is that what it is? I forget, because it's not a real strong concept, but at some point, if you look into it, you do learn 6 is a perfect number. Yeah, exactly.
Who knows? And I learned from Schoolhouse Rock that 3 is a magic number. So who knows? Okay. Number 5. What are some of the dangers of secular humanistic Jews identifying with Hellenistic Judaism, and what are some of the promises?
Well, the dangers are that the Hellenistic Jews died out. We don't want to.
Not a good role model. Okay.
Well, you don't want to do projecting, which can happen when you tie in too much. You put too much on an analogy. You can end up projecting where it is inappropriate. But I'd say promises is, I mean, it's always good when you feel connection to someone or a group or whatever. And it also, again, bolsters the argument that, while secular humanist Judaism may be, technically new, it is part of a tradition of adaptation and change and questioning. It's not like adaptation, change, and questioning is brand new. It's just, this is the most recent iteration of that.
Yeah, it's a great. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was also going to say that secular humanistic Jews were aware of our human characteristics that were responding to our context. Hellenistic Judaism had a very different context, and you can't separate either phenomenon from its context.
Right, very good. And it's always nice to see a sense of roots. They were asking the same questions. They were saying some of the same things we were doing. They were grappling with some of the same issues we're still grappling with, even if their answers might have been different because of context or because of a divergent ideology. We can admit the similarities, but also highlight the differences. And one other point, it helps make the argument that there's always been Jewish diversity. If you get one takeaway lesson from this entire ancient period that we've been covering, it's that there's always been multiple ways that Judeans have felt it was appropriate to do Jewish, whether it was the polytheistic versus the monotheistic, or the Yahweh alone versus Yahweh and other gods, or now in this period, you've got the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the Essenes and the Hellenistic Jews. there's always been a diverse approach to Jewish identities. It hasn't only been one tradition. And so our diversity is reflecting a universal Jewish phenomenon, not something that's radically brand new or an unprecedented break with an uninterrupted line of unchallenged, uniform Jewish tradition going back to Moses and his bar mitzvah with an ice sculpture.
I think it's really important to say, yeah, and just to say what you're saying in a different way, but these are my words, that yes, there is a tradition in our history that we have been sensitive to our embedding our host cultures, and we extract what's good about it. We align with it. That doesn't mean we're doing it in the same way now, but it's a very Jewish thing to be responsive to the world around us and to honor it and to partake of it.
I wanted to say, oh, I'm sorry. I wanted to say just one thing. I think that the Hellenism is certainly a basis for the Enlightenment, the idea of questioning and exploring and reason being the basis for things. And it strikes me that humanistic Judaism comes very much out of the Enlightenment traditions in a certain way. Secondly, I think if you just look at the Bible itself with at least its 4 different, P and J and E, and D versions, you can see right away the Jews didn't always agree.
Right. Well, look, the phenomenon of 2 Jews, 3 opinions, that goes back a long time. Go ahead, Roger.
I was saying, isn't things like rabbis wearing robes and having choirs and such, essentially us doing the same thing in the United States
and in Germany before that, because the reform movement starts there. Yeah, we'll talk about that when we get to the beginnings of the reform movement. The same phenomenon of being like the people around us. That's the perennial challenge of the modern world. Yeah, go ahead, Michelle.
Well, yeah, I just also want to point out that I do think sometimes when, through history, when Jews adapt, it's more than just taking the best out of a culture. It's also it's self-preservation. You adapt, and so you aren't as noticed, and perhaps not going to be the scapegoat or
I mean, the dilemma is that sometimes it's hard to adapt enough for the people who really don't like you, because then they say you're hiding who you really are. Or why are you bothering to be different anymore? Why not just be like everybody else? Why not be a citizen of the world? And why maintain your stubborn difference?
It's also interesting if you think about what's happened with Christianity as well, with the different sects of Christianity, Baptist and Catholic and Protestants and, whomever else, they've all adapted in different ways and felt that there was good or bad parts of their religion that they could manage to either hold on to or to change. And so I think that's probably been throughout the world and from the time of any kind of religion that people have, taken on the parts that they feel are best for themselves and find fellow people who think the same way that they do.
And then condemn the people who don't.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a universal human practice. I actually, Michelle, when you started, I thought you were going to say they not only took the good stuff from the people around them, but they took some of the bad stuff too, like the materialism and the bad music and whatever else. Okay, so last question here. How is the Jewish diaspora experience of Greek and Maccabean periods similar to modern Jewish diasporas? And how is it different? And I'll just highlight again, the term diaspora originally applied to the Greek city-states that were formed along the Mediterranean basin, because it's a Greek word, dias, spreading, spore, seeds. You spread the seeds out, they plant roots and they grow different in different soil. So diaspora really does apply to Babylonia, to Alexandria and other places Jews settled. So how is their diaspora experience of that period similar to our own diaspora experience, and how might it have been different?
Well, I think initially there's a sense of moving away from the temple as the center part of Jewishism. So you have to have new centers because you're not close to the temple. You can't go and do things. So I think that's one thing.
Even if you're pointed back at the temple, your ideal is pilgrimage there, but you got to come up with something in the meantime.
Yeah.
When you're not able to go. And by the way, in Orthodox synagogues, the direction of prayer is still pointed at Jerusalem. There's a Mizrach, a Western wall is marked as a way to point toward Jerusalem. Although now that we know the world is round, it doesn't really matter which way you point because it can all be pointed at Jerusalem eventually.
Well, in a diaspora, there's always a tension between where you are and where you aren't. And it's what do you owe to the center where you aren't? And what do you do in the center where you are? There's always that tension, and it's going to resolve differently. And part of what happens is the host culture will attack Jews on having their dual loyalties. Are they allegiant to Israel? Are they allegiant to the host United States? We've always got that problem. So that problem is part of the similarity. Mm-hmm. And the resolution can be different.
Susie, it's if you can't be with the one you love the one you're with.
Or live alone as I do.
So, I mean, some other parallels, linguistic assimilation, cultural assimilation, we're more comfortable in English than we are in Hebrew or in Yiddish for that matter, or Ladino or other historic Jewish languages. The idea of having major diaspora centers and multiple ones, that's still the case today. It's not all one place. The idea of having a common focus, as I mentioned, all those synagogues that are still pointed at Jerusalem, even if there isn't a temple there anymore, there's still the Temple Mount, there's still that orientation. That's why many synagogues have American flags and Israeli flags on the bima, on the podium. The whole idea of living in a dynamic and mobile trading economy, that's the capitalist world we're in now. And for good or for ill, it's something that has actually been relatively good for the Jews. It's been bad too, but it's been good in some ways. We've done better. We've done better under capitalist societies than we've done under radical socialist societies. Soviet Union was not good for the Jews. I'll put it that way. This is one of those challenges. But on the other hand, Jews living in Sweden are having it pretty good with their universal health care. There's no one perfect system for us. I wrote my column in the Shofar recently about this. But in the end, we're living in that same kind of marketplace experience that the Jews were beginning to be exposed to in the Hellenistic period. Yeah.
But also in with the modern diaspora, we're allowed to have allegiances in two places. We can identify as Jews, but we also can identify as Americans or Swedes, but that wasn't the case. From what you've been talking about, that was not allowed.
Or it was harder to sell because you couldn't sacrifice to the city gods, for example. That was an inhibition there. And honestly, Susie, for all of the fears of dual loyalty accusations, it's happened relatively rarely in American political life that Jews are accused of being more loyal to Israel since the founding of the modern state. It has happened, but not as much as people feared it would happen. Even after the Jonathan Pollard affair, which was a person working for the Defense Department who was paid to spy for Israel, you didn't have pogroms, you didn't have loyalty tests, you didn't have all the things people were afraid might have happened in a more anti-Semitic cultural context. Europe certainly has had different challenges, but in America, it's been less the case.
In America, it seems very similar to the accusations towards Catholics of being loyal to the Pope over the U.S. Constitution. It's where there's the group of radicals who are saying it, and the majority of their people are it'll be fine.
Well, now they do, but in 1960 that was a big deal when Kennedy was running.
I was going to say my mother was absolutely positive that the Pope was now going to run America.
My wife's aunt was certain that he was going to make everybody have spaghetti.
What's wrong with that?
It's the Italian Catholic thing. I don't know.
Spaghetti is good.
He was Irish. He wasn't Italian.
Well, whatever. But I mean,
Chinese.
Yeah. Actually, spaghetti is Chinese, but that's another issue.
Well, okay. This is the historian's version of food history. Okay. So the last point I wanted to make is that in terms of differences, what counts as liberal Judaism today is different from what counted as liberal Judaism in the Hellenistic period. I mean, even the Hellenistic Jews would occasionally go on pilgrimage to Jerusalem and pay for animals to be sacrificed there. I mean, that was part of their practice too. And Israel now is not as central to Jewish identity and diaspora as Jerusalem was then. And there are plenty of Jews today whose life does not revolve around Israel, but still feel connected to Jewish culture in the broad, more diverse understanding. Also, we have different diasporas speaking different languages. You know, Jews in Argentina are not interested in English because their non-Jewish language is Spanish, and they write Hanukkah Januka, because in Spanish, the chota is the ch. So you spell Hanukkah in Spanish Januka, and you spell it with a ch, they won't know how to say it. And
I think one of the big things is the slippery slope here. When you lived in Judea and you can sacrifice at the temple, you get to follow everything. Now you're in distance and you can't follow every single rule. So at that point, you have to determine which rules you can follow and which you can't. And that becomes a real slippery slope.
Yep. And the other major problem that will come up in our next session is what happens if that one center that was tying all these disparate sects together gets destroyed. You know, it wasn't just the concept of Jerusalem and sort of a distant vision. It was a real Jerusalem temple with priests and sacrifices that atoned for sins. And what's going to happen? Well, spoiler alert, there's another fire on the way. And I'll also mention one last mistake of the Maccabees. The Maccabees were not immune to the same rivalries and tensions that split the Pietists and the Hellenizers a century before. By the 60s of before the Common Era, there were rival Maccabean high priests that were arguing with each other. And then one of them had the bright idea to invite the Romans in to arbitrate the dispute. And guess what the Romans tend to do when invited in? They stay. And that winds up being the end of the Hasmonean independent kingdom, which we'll talk more about next time. So thanks very much for coming. I hope you found this interesting and enlightening in advance of Hanukkah. Ha, ha, ha.
And Hanukkah starts Wednesday or Thursday night?
Thursday night.
Thursday night, thank you.
Yep.
I have 2 days to retrieve my stuff.
Yes.
In the basement.
One nifty side effect of the prevalence of Christianity and there being a story about a specific type of coin apparently in the New Testament. I'm not familiar with it, but anyway, you can get reproductions of one of the Hasmonean coins really cheap online because apparently some churches and stuff will like give them out as, I don't know, goodie bag trinkets for a story of the widow's mite or whatever. But I've got a little bag. I actually use it in Dungeons and Dragons, but of little Hasmonean bronze coin reproductions, which are pretty neat.
Well, that story of the martyrs that appears that we saw in chapter 7 of 2 Maccabees, that became really important for the early Christian church because they were enduring martyrdom, right? And this becomes a prefiguration of the kind of faith that the early Christian martyrs needed to witness the truth of their faith in Jesus. So the Maccabean story becomes important for them as fighting for the faith and dying for the faith, even more specifically, even if it's from, you know, a pre-Jesus period. You know, this is over 150 years before Jesus is supposedly born. But the story becomes important as a prefiguration. And the same is true for Philo, who's writing before Jesus is around, but he's, again, trying to harmonize the Old Testament beliefs. And that Septuagint is adopted as the basis for the Old Testament, even if it includes stuff that's way before Jesus, because it's all understood as the preface, as the prequel to the real story, which will take place during the Roman period.